Welcome to the Happy Mindset, episode 127. Today's episode is called The Practice. Today I'm joined by Seth Godin. Seth is a teacher at heart. He's a writer and a marketer, a sharer of ideas. Seth was one of the guys who I started reading back in the day when I developed a reading habit, and he was one of those people that really made an influence on the way I thought about things. Some of his books include Linchpin, Purple Cow, The Dip, This is Marketing. His latest book is The Practice. So he's taught me a lot about education, a lot about independent thinking. I think that's one of the key things. He taught me about the power of independent thinking from reading his books. Like Linchpin discusses the power of that individual who isn't the cog in the machine. And so said over the years, he's just got a great way of relaying information. Purple Cow, even the books look different as well. Purple Cow is like a book that looks appealing on the cover. He also had another book where he didn't have a title to it. Can't remember what that book was again, but again, it was another simple yet ingenious idea to put a book out there that didn't have the name on the cover, and it would spark a conversation. So I suppose the biggest thing I get from Seth's work is there's an element of thoughtfulness to it. There's an element of wanting to really connect with people and really have a conversation. And yeah, that's why I enjoyed today's episode. That's why I enjoyed having Seth on the podcast. He's also got a program called the AltMBA. If you want to check that out, it's like an alternative to the MBA, and it seems to be more practical, as in practical projects, people working together, collaborating like you do in the real world, giving you a taste of that. So I like that Seth's very practical as well when it comes down to it. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I know you take a lot of value from listening to Seth, and thanks again for listening. Okay, so thanks for joining us today, Seth. It's an honor to have you on the show. Your books have really made an influence on me. So it's great to have you on.
Well, thanks. It's such a pleasure.
So my first question is, who are you and what are you doing in the world today?
I'm a teacher and an author, sometimes an entrepreneur. I've written 19 books. The 20th one's coming out this week. I write about how the world and culture affect our choices, and I write about creativity and making a difference.
Culture. Can you talk about culture? Like, what does culture mean for you when you say that?
Yeah, it's the answer to the question, what are things like around here? And if we lived 100 years ago or 100 years in the future, that would be the biggest thing we would notice, that change. What are things like around here? How do we get to work? How do we interrupt somebody? How do we decide who's up and who's down? How do we decide that breakfast is a meal? You know, all of these things are cultural inventions. None of them were hardwired. And if you start to notice them, you realize you can change them.
When did you start to notice the culture in that way?
When I showed up for my first real job, it was a spectacular shift, because unlike showing up at college or something where everyone's showing up the first day, I was showing up at a place that was already organized as an adult. And I think that was probably the first time that I said, wait, I'm sort of committing to live in a foreign country right now, even though it's the place I've always lived, because what I wear is different and how I'm supposed to engage with other people is different, and all the language and stuff. And what I realized was a summer job that turned into a full-time job is the culture sort of had grown accidentally, and I could change it if I wanted to. And every time I took a risk and leaned into the culture and tried to change it, it was scary, and sometimes it worked, and that was thrilling. And then I got hooked on, this thing we think as permanent isn't so permanent.
You have a few examples of the changes of you leaning into the culture and actually seeing the change happening.
So my job was to launch a line of science fiction adventure games. And I had no employees at the company. There were about 50 people there at the time. I was the marketing person. But I needed programmers, I needed artists, I needed musicians inside the company who would choose to work on my project instead of a different project, because I couldn't order them to do anything. And it was right when the Mac had been first invented. And I had one of the first Macs in the world. I was a beta tester. And there was a piece of software on it called Ready, Set, Go. And Ready, Set, Go was the first desktop publishing program that was available. So I was desktop publishing a newsletter. And every couple of days, I would print out 50 copies of my newsletter about what people in the company were up to and how my project was going, how other people's projects were going. And then I would put it in that little mail slot that every person at work has before email, right? And you'd watch, because it was on yellow paper, you'd watch every morning people would go and see this piece of paper. And sometimes their name was on it. And that's what everyone would do, is rush to read the part with their name on it, right? And what I discovered is that not only was I connecting the community, but I was gaining trust, because I was the narrator. I was the town crier. So people were coming to me to be in the newsletter. And the culture of the entire company began to shift just a little, because suddenly it wasn't, oh, I'm in my cube, who are these other people? It was, here's this group. And even though I was only 23 years old, I realized that my projects were probably going to be more likely to work because the community saw them as our projects instead.
Okay. Is that when you started seeing like a tribes element to things as well?
Yeah, I didn't have language around a lot of these things, and part of what I do is write, come up with the right phrase and it can stick with people better. But the book Tribes is about how small the circles in our lives are and how we really can choose to lead them if we want to, but it's scary.
Yeah, what do you think stopping us from leading tribes in our immediate circles?
Right, so these are all forms of shipping. That why are people afraid of public speaking? Public speaking isn't physically dangerous. Why are we afraid of even giving a toast at our best friend's wedding, right? Nothing bad is going to happen. And yet people lose a lot of sleep out of it, over it, because it's one thing, it's fun to think about your best friend, but it's scary to ship the toast because you only get to ship it once. You only get to speak up in that moment once. You don't want to do it wrong. You don't want to be misjudged. You don't want to be misunderstood. You don't want to let people down. And so we invent this whole monologue for ourselves about failure and about our voice and about trusting ourselves. And so what I'm writing about now is the whole challenge of trusting ourselves.
Why do you think we have a difficulty trusting ourselves in the first place?
Because evolution is real, and millions of years of genes competing with one another have demonstrated that a species that does things it's not sure is going to work doesn't last long enough to have grandchildren. And so every wild animal, they're not really wild, they should be called scared animals because they're scared. They want it to be like it was yesterday. So that's who humans began as, creatures that want tomorrow to be like yesterday. But then culture showed up. It's this weird hack, this byproduct that no one really planned for. And culture says tomorrow cannot be like yesterday. And that is the game. And so we have the two things competing against each other all the time. The game to keep things the same and safe, and the game to make things interesting and better.
As a marketer, what do you see people generally misunderstand about marketing as a craft?
Well, marketing is completely misunderstood because people think it's the same as advertising, or they think it's about hyping lousy stuff to people who don't want it, or they think it's about lying. It's none of those things. We don't have words for those things. Call those things scamming or hustling. Marketing is about telling a true story to people who want to hear it. It's about bringing ideas to people who would miss them if you didn't. Marketing at its best is what we wake up in the morning hoping to be able to do, which is to be seen, to be understood, to make things better. That's marketing. That's what I'm calling it. And since I wrote the book, This is Marketing, I'm allowed to call it anything I want.
Did you always have that clear of understanding of marketing, or was it something, again, through action and through experience, you got the words and the language for it?
Right. That's a great question. So what happened at the software company I was telling you about is we had a really good first year that I was there. And so I had millions of dollars to spend on advertising. And I was in the marketing department. So that's what I thought marketing was, that my job was to take money and figure out how to get shelf space and how to interrupt people. And then I met a guy named Jay Levinson. and he wrote the first guerrilla marketing book. And together, he and I wrote 4 or 5 other books. And what Jay helped me see, his tone was different than mine, but what he helped me see is that marketing was way bigger than who's going to run an ad. And ever since then, my definition just keeps getting broader. So permission marketing is about running ads and email when the world is filled with noise and you have to earn attention. But it isn't a book about how do you craft the work you're doing to truly resonate with the audience you seek to serve. So it keeps evolving. And now I'm of the opinion that if there's a person, a cause, an organization, a brand you care about, it's because they did good marketing.
Okay. The writing, when did that come in? Like, when did you become a writer? Do you remember thinking you're a writer one day, or was it just you wrote a lot of different books? Was that an intention that you wanted to begin with to be a writer, or did it just happen organically?
Well, my high school teacher wrote in my yearbook that I would never amount to anything. So, and I only took 1 English class in college. So I certainly did not think that I was a writer. And the first book I did with Chip Conley in 1986 really wasn't writing either. I mean, we collected rules of thumb from around the world. But something weird happened about 6 months after the book came out. Warner Books sent me a copy in French. And I held this book up in a language I don't speak with my name on the cover. And I still remember saying, whoa, maybe I am a writer. And, you know, Carl Reiner just passed away, the great director and comedian. And he said, look, I didn't become a director. I pretended I was a director. And I pretended I was a writer. And then one day I was. And that's what I did. I just pretended I was a writer until one day I was.
What has writing given you in your life? Have you seen a difference between how you think about the world from being a writer?
Oh, yeah, it made a huge difference. And it's mostly the blog. I think everyone should blog every day. And if you don't want to do it under your own name, that's fine. But knowing I'm going to ship something tomorrow makes me pay attention today. And saying my words out loud and not wanting to be a hypocrite helps me make my words better.
That makes sense, yeah. Another thing I picked up on from you is that you're very, with your words, you use them wisely. You tend to use few words. What's the thinking behind that? Even your book, The Dip, there's 96 pages to that. What's the benefit to, I think you even said it's more difficult as well to have a shorter narrative than it is to go on and on.
It is, because I'm noticing on this podcast I'm talking too much, but it is hard to boil it down. And the reason is, just like giving that speech at your best friend's wedding, if you boil it down, you don't get to fill in all the apologies and the what ifs and the maybes and every other possibility. It's like I said, these 7 words, which means a lot of people aren't going to get the joke. And that brings in the idea of the smallest viable audience and understanding who it is for, because making who it is for the right thing is the door to doing the work you want to do.
When did you start realizing the importance of the minimum viable audience, like the smaller audience who actually resonate what you want rather than people who don't get the joke?
Yeah, I only named that in the book before this one. This is marketing, but I've been living it my whole life. I've always been afraid of being a number 1 hit. I've always been afraid of having the biggest group because it just doesn't feel right to me. It feels like you've compromised too much. And for a while, I just hid from the chance to make something bigger. But then I realized it was my choice, that I didn't want to make a number 1 anything. I wanted to make the number 9 thing that the people who liked it really liked.
So that was always something you had. There was never a period where you were taken in by the mass, like this idea of making something that would suit everybody. You never had that thing, right?
I was totally seduced by it. That's why I lost every single election in high school over and over again, every single time. And it's because elections go to the person with the most votes. And after that, I said, I'm not going to run anymore because I do better work if I'm not trying to please everybody.
So you learned it in high school, that lesson.
I learned a lot of lessons in high school, mostly with someone pushing me down the street. But yeah.
Why do you think people they generally don't take a stand and do work that matters and that they care about just for the sake of it to begin with? To take a stand and say, this is what I care about, and I'm going to start creating work that matters to me first. Anyway.
Yeah, because your heart's going to get broken over and over again. That's why it's easier to not trust people. Because if you don't trust people, no one's going to disappoint you. The problem is you end up living a life where you don't trust anybody and you never do the work you want to do. And so on top of that, the culture has brainwashed us into believing that we need to fit in, we need to work in the factory, we need to buy the most popular item. It's not an accident that 1 out of 7 meals in the United States are served by McDonald's, right? Because if you buy in to the system, you're going to get exactly what you want at McDonald's.
Was it through time that you cut through the culture to an extent where you could do your own work? Or I think sometimes I found in my path that I was aware that the culture was influencing me, but I was so in the thick of it, it was hard to pull back because there was such a pull there. Did you ever experience that, like that resistance there?
Oh yeah, and I still do to this day. I mean, here in the US and, the pandemic that spread around the world, but the whole idea of racial injustice or the whole idea that 7 towns over someone doesn't have clean water or whatever it is, there's a push for it to be, well, what's my problem? What's on my agenda today? Not all of us. And so the culture is very seductive. And, one day I still remember, just to see what would happen, I wore a white shirt and white pants at the same time. Because everyone has both, but you never wear both at the same time.
What did you learn from that?
And the feedback was truly overwhelming and urgent that I had done something really stupid. Or just before the pandemic, I went to the last conference I spoke at, and I didn't want to shake anybody's hand because the pandemic was like in the air, and people were really offended that I gave them a Vulcan salute instead of shaking their hand. Now, handshaking, first of all, is dumb, but secondly, it doesn't impart real value. You're not worried about whether someone's got a sword, which is why it was invented. And yet, just that single change in culture, so much power to make us feel bad if we don't get the joke.
Were you ever in a stage in your life where you were quite reactive when you got bad feedback or when things didn't go your way? And if you were, how did you start to change your relationship with that?
I've never been good at the first one. And I don't like anonymous negative feedback. I have a hard time if someone doesn't hear what I meant to say and is offended by it. And so my solution, which is productive but not brave, is I don't read my reviews. I haven't read them in more than 7 years because I've never met an author who said, I read all my 1-star reviews on Amazon and now I'm a better writer. It's not going to make me a better writer. All a 1-star review means is the book wasn't for you. Okay, thanks for letting me know. I don't need to know anything else about why it wasn't for you because I didn't write it for you. We both agree on that. And so part of what it means to be a productive creative is to decide whose voice we're going to let inside our head in the first place.
That requires discipline too.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we kind of think as creative people that that discipline stifles creativity, where I think it's discipline allows you to focus on what matters. When you can focus on what matters, you get more clarity, more space in your mind to be creative.
Exactly right. You nailed it.
Yeah. That was a tough one to understand, though. But with your podcast, why did you decide to do a podcast, and has it had any influence on your writing? over the last 2 years or so since you've had it, since it started?
Yeah, these are great questions. As you know, I love the structure of media. I was one of the pioneers of email marketing. I was one of the pioneers of the internet. I was one of the pioneers of CD-ROM, which went nowhere. I once made a video that Siskel and Ebert gave 2 thumbs up to. So I like playing in a different medium. So I did a podcast a really long time ago that wasn't really a podcast. It was just a recording of a conference I did. And so I started thinking about podcasting, and I started thinking about what the rules of podcasting would become and how I would do a podcast that would be different than what everyone decided a podcast was supposed to be. But I was afraid because it's another medium and it was another commitment. You got to commit to 100 episodes. But then this guy showed up and he said, if you're really willing to do a podcast, we got a sponsor. And I was like, well, this is someone calling my bluff. Because if I don't say yes to this, then I can never talk about podcasting ever again. Here's my chance. And so I did it. Now we don't have a sponsor anymore, which is better. And it gave me a chance to explore concepts that were too big for a blog post. But in terms of changing my writing, I don't think it's changed my writing.
When it comes to the episodes as well, do you have any reservations about not having it accurate all the time? Like when you're playing with stuff, it's out there and it's published. Do you have any fear around you saying the wrong thing or that's not factually correct sometimes?
Yeah. So my blog I can edit and I fix typos all the time. Once or twice I have made significant, embarrassing, shameful mistakes in my podcast, and my producer Alex has fixed them. But we try not to do that. I think the promise of my podcast, which becomes clear by the fact that there's no staff, there's no credits. I just go into the shower and make a podcast. And my show notes link to Wikipedia usually. Your mileage may vary, and I try not to hurt anybody or make absolute statements that are clearly untrue. But I make mistakes all the time. And if you need medical advice, please don't ask me.
Yeah. Where does the name come from, Akimbo? Why did you go with that?
It's a word from Northern Europe that means the crook in the river, the bend in the river. And it turns out that if you take a piece of almost anything and make it slightly bent, it's stronger than if it's just a piece that's straight. And Wonder Woman and Superman stand with their arms akimbo, whether it's folded or on their hips. And I just love the phrase arms akimbo. And so when I was building a podcast about changing the culture, it felt to me like that word signified a lot of what I was talking about, because we can bend things and we can make them better.
Okay, so that's where it came from, your desire to change the culture. That's where the podcast came from. Well, that's where a lot of your work comes from, but that was the intention behind the podcast, was it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. The AltMBA course, when did that come into your head as a good idea, and what drove that? Why did you decide that was something that was needed?
Right. So the AltMBA, now in its 5th year, has trained almost 5,000 people. It's an intensive 30-day workshop that happens online in 79 countries. And I'm not in it. There's no guru time. It's not like you're going to hang out with someone who knows wisdom. You're going to hang out with each other. So how did it come to be? Well, just like podcasts, I saw that the world of education was changing. And if you have access to the internet, I was wondering, why do you need to go to a place to learn something? And if I could build an online learning opportunity that wasn't like any of the other ones, which have a 96% dropout rate, which scale to huge numbers. What if I built one that had a 4% dropout rate? What if I built one that only works for 120 to 200 people at a time? What if I built one that was in real time, not asynchronous? And I've just made a list of all the things that were the opposite of what people might expect. And we launched the first one as an experiment. And then we did the second one because people couldn't get into the first one. And then I was going to be done because I was just trying to make a point. But it has worked so well, we keep doing it. And now If you go to akimbo.com, you can see all of our workshops. But basically, the idea is learning is the key to all of this. Learning is how we are going to change things. If you can keep a kid from dropping out of school when they're in 10th grade, their whole life is different. There's no bigger thing other than maybe healthcare that you could do to change the arc of someone's life than expose them to learning. And so now we're focused on doing that at a bigger scale in a way that we're proud of.
What was the key things that you did actually implement that shifted it from 96% dropout to 4? Or were some of the key things that were different to what other people do?
Yeah. So the biggest one is it's in real time, so people notice if you don't show up. And then we go get you. The second thing is we have coaches. Our coaches are all alumni. There's a coach for every 8 people or something like that, 10. So you will be recognized. You will be seen. You will be heard. And that means that during the first 3 days, you're not going to drop out because it would be embarrassing. And then 3 days into it, you're not going to drop out because now you've just discovered what it feels like to really learn something. Because what learning is, which is different than education, learning is hard and scary. And if it's easy in, easy out, well, the reason so many people drop out of other courses, because as soon as learning shows up, they leave. But here, you can't leave because you're committed. And that enrollment is the magical game changer. Everything after that was easy. But having the guts to do that, that was the key.
Because I heard you talk about enrollment. It's really about getting the student to buy into their own learning journey.
Correct.
That they're active in it.
Trust yourself. Exactly right.
Yeah. What are your thoughts at the moment where we are with technology and the online space, and then you've got the traditional way of doing things in school, going to university? Do you think there's a lag there going on at the moment where the technology is there, but it's just not being connected into the real world?
It's
and how do we bridge that?
It's a huge chasm between education and learning, between in-person and online. That during the pandemic, forcing people from institutions to do education at home, it was a failure. I haven't heard anybody say it wasn't a failure. People, instead of spending 4 hours, were spending 14 minutes. And it was all about, is this on the test? If it's not on the test, I'm going back to what I was doing. That butts and seats are a key part of compliance. And going forward, we need to educate too many people to rely on butts and seats. And we're going to have to figure out how to get testing not to be the dominant force, how to get compliance not to be the dominant force, how to make it so that peer-to-peer interaction is possible. Because guess what? Student-to-teacher interaction cannot scale. You cannot teach a class with 1,000 students and answer their questions. It's impossible. But if students are answering each other's questions, then it scales forever.
Yeah, I get that, yeah. I think a big part that was missing for me when I was going through the traditional way of doing things was not much of a focus on my actual questions and not much of a focus on where do I actually want to go with my life and how do I create things that matter to me.
Yep.
I think that was the thing. And then creativity, when did that start becoming something that's
always been there?
Yeah.
It's always been there. It's just hard to show. If you show up and say, I want to teach you about creativity, everyone rolls their eyes.
Yeah.
Because it's always had a lack of rigor. But ultimately, all of the conversations I have ever had with any student, with any person I've volunteered to help out, because I don't do any coaching, is, okay, well, you sort of know what to do. Why aren't you doing it? They don't want to ship creative work. Shipping creative work is frightening. And so nobody can teach you how to have much better ideas than you already do. The only way to get much better ideas is to ship the work, see what works, and do it again. But if you're afraid to ship the work, then you're stuck. And so shipping the work is a practice, leaning into a practice, same way a doctor or a lawyer or a musician has a practice, means that you will become more creative. And if you become more creative, you will solve problems. And if you solve problems, you're making things better.
So with your new book, what's the intention behind it? What are the things that you're getting across in the book that you think are lacking in awareness right now around creativity in its implementation in the real world?
Well, we'll start with the fact that there's no such thing as writer's block. And that if you think you're blocked, that was your choice. We'll talk about the fact that creativity is actually a generous act. And if you realize you're doing it for other people, it's way easier to get out of your own way. We can talk about the fact that genre is the hidden element of culture in the work we produce. The minute you said, I'm going to write a mystery novel, so many of the things you're going to have to live with were announced by saying those two words. Because novels feel a certain way. They're a certain length. They're sold a certain way. They're engaged with a certain way. You bought all of that just by saying two words, right? I want to be a painter and I want someone to buy my painting. That's a genre right there. And real creativity happens when you see the genre and bend it just enough. If you bend it too much, you're ignored. If you don't bend it at all, you're a hack. But in between those two, on the edge of the box, if you understand genre, you have a chance to change things.
Did you find that through practice by bending it too much but not bending it enough? How did you find that balance? Yeah.
Over and over and over again.
When did you start realizing that creativity was a generous act?
I learned it from my parents from a young age. They showed up in the community where I grew up. They helped run spiritual institutions. They led nonprofits. They created new causes. But they didn't do it for themselves. They didn't get a prize. They did it because they cared about the people around them. And I liked our neighbors. I liked their friends. But mostly their friends were hiding behind compliance and doing their job and taking care of their family. And so I learned from an early age that this generous act my parents brought to the world every day, that was going to be my path.
And when it came to education, when you're in the system, did you notice that it was off when you were there? Or was it when you came out of the system?
Not only did I notice, the system noticed too. The system was delighted to have me step away. I didn't go to my second year of business school, and I found a professor who was happy enough to give me a degree because I just kept trying to go to the edges and beyond. And a successful institution doesn't want you to do that. They want you to be processed. And so the educational industrial complex is real, and we get to decide what we're going to do about it.
Curiosity, did you always have that in you, or is it something you had to develop after a while?
I'm going to argue that it's the other way around. I have never met a 3-year-old who wasn't curious. I don't know if you have. So everyone is curious, and some people get it drilled out of them and some people don't. And for whatever reason, partly due to my parents, partly due to luck, it didn't get drilled out of me. And if it got drilled out of you, you can go get it back. Just ask the question why a lot.
Yeah. When it comes to a teacher, what makes a great teacher in your point of view?
Well, if we think about the fact that many of us were lucky enough to have had at least one good teacher growing up, I want to argue it's not about the transfer of curriculum. I think it's about earning enrollment. That teacher became a great teacher after we decided they were a great teacher because we leaned into their work, because we didn't have to be pushed or shoved into doing the work that was on our homework, but we were actually interested. So there are lots of ways to become a great teacher. Being interesting is a good thing. Being interested is a good thing. Figuring out how to demonstrate a certain sort of charisma so that people want to come with you, understanding status roles, being willing to challenge the edges, not trying to teach everybody, just trying to teach some people. I mean, so many different ways that you could become a better teacher, but all of them are about how do you end up with better students? Because you have to have better students if you want to be a better teacher.
And what would be a great student in your mind? What would they look like?
They're enrolled. They want to go where you're going, right? I mean, nobody says, I have to go to the baseball game. Nobody says, I have to go to a Grateful Dead concert. If If you're going to go to a Grateful Dead concert, you're going voluntarily. So the Dead got the chance to do their work. The Dead would have been a horrible opening act for the Rolling Stones. Horrible. People would have thrown things at them because the people in the audience weren't there for the Grateful Dead. They were there for the Rolling Stones. And so the art of it is attract customers, students, fans, whatever it is, who want to be there and not worry so much about the other ones.
Do you think it's possible to be curious when you see something as an obligation? You're obliged to do something.
It's harder. It's definitely harder. But yeah, it's doable. You think about people who have a calling, spiritual leaders or whatever, and some of them are just obedient because it's their calling and they're trying to fit in. And some of them are truly curious because the calling is insufficient. They have to figure out how to contribute.
Hmm. And the other question I had was with your books, do you have a general process with that? Is there a general time frame that you write them in, or
nope?
does it
I'm very
depend?
sloppy.
Yeah.
I'm very sloppy about it. I don't consider myself a professional at that craft.
And has your blog, the consistency with it, has that helped you to produce so many books?
I have no idea. I know that I am a professional at creating a daily blog. I have excellent hygiene about creating my blog. I approach it as somebody who is going to make another blog post tomorrow. And that rigor opens the door for me.
Mm-hmm. You always think of yourself as a professional when you're blogging? Was there a period before that?
Oh yeah, I've been doing it for more than 20 years. Until you get to the blog post about the Provincetown helmet insight, I was just fooling around and I was experimenting. After that blog post, I was like, okay, now this is what I'm going to do.
What actually changed in your writing then when you committed to it? Did it look different in any way, or like what was the change there?
Yeah, it was no longer about me. I wasn't writing for me. I was writing for the person who was reading it.
Oh, okay. Okay, I get that. Yeah, okay. That's good. Yeah, no, that's. I think that's about it today. That
was fantastic.
Covered a lot of stuff
pleasure.
there. No, it was a pleasure. Yeah, thanks for covering all that stuff, and I learned a lot. Grateful for your time.
You. Thanks for doing it.
Where would people find you online, Seth?
Where do they find me online? You can find my blog at seths.blog. The new book is The Practice, available at all fine bookstores around the world. And Akimbo is at akimbo.com. And there's also a link to the podcast there as well.
Perfect. Looking forward to reading it. Best of luck with everything, Seth. Thanks again. Until next time, have fun and enjoy the process.
Thanks. We'll see you. Keep
Thanks,
making
Seth.
a ruckus.
Thank you.